Eric, my friend, welcome to the Campfire sessions. It's going to be a pleasure to sit down and have this ongoing conversation that we've been having lately.
Agree. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The more that we've talked back and forth during the dialogue, I've really gotten intrigued by your ideas around the concept of personal growth.
hmm Yeah,
And I,
I think it's one of those funny things too, is like, I think, like you and I are similar in that regard of like, a lot of it comes from, my own self-work and worth and all those sort of things behind it. And then once you figure out something's going on, you almost in some ways have an obligation to learn to share and teach it. So I think for me, it was a funny thing. I went through a bunch of, I'm constantly growing and learning, but I had this cool opportunity to teach. One of my mentors actually said like, hey, you're going through some stuff here. You got to figure out what it is. And the best way to do that is to teach it to others. And that experience like really taught me a lot, like of learning how to teach and share and that kind of stuff. And I think it's kind of changed my whole worldview of like, once you learn something for yourself, the best way to understand really what's happening is to teach it to others.
I can agree with that a lot because, I've really rebuilt myself literally one swing of the hatchet at a time. And the more that I get out on the trail with people and I start teaching them all these different skills that I utilized in order to build my self-value. I've seen that within them. And it's almost like looking in a mirror. And you start to really understand where that growth came from.
hmm
And then you get the opportunity to embrace your strengths that are
hmm
within that. But also you get to dissect your weaknesses.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, well, it's this circle, right? Like you never sort of are satisfied, and you're constantly, knowing that, like you said, the next day you get up and swing the hatchet again. So I think it is that kind of real importance of kind of never ending growth. But ultimately, I do think that once you start to grow yourself, you realize that now you have an obligation of once you sort of get yourself to that point, in some senses you have an obligation to share and show. And the next piece of this is to say, okay, now I've got myself to a steady point, or a more aligned point. How do I pay it forward?
Which becomes like I think a question a lot of us wrestle with in the back of our minds, but we're afraid to actually incorporate that
hmm
because we're almost afraid that if we give away our tools that we've developed, somebody's going to overtake us.
hmm hmm Yeah. It's an interesting, it's funny about it too, is I think it's in some senses, you know, I mean, it's hard today than maybe it has ever been in history. I mean, there's so many great opportunities, but there's also challenges today that I think that if you look back 20, 30 years ago, growing up and living today, the expectations are just different. It used to be, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you would work from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. and you go home and you're done. You don't like have your phone, you don't have works on weekends. People can't get a hold of you unless it's really, really urgent. And so I think, sort of what's interesting to think about is we've gone from this world of where it was fairly blocked out. Like you had this time that you worked and you had this time that you lived. And I think those have blurred a lot. And I think what sort of you see today in more than anything is that I think people are almost feeling like they're got all these plates spinning that are constantly needing to be spun, and they're dropping more of them. So I think that's a lot of where I see happening. And I'm really fortunate. I get to work with a lot of really interesting people. Like, I teach hundreds of, students every year, and I get to work with some ambitious people writing books. So I see a lot of people, but I think that is the trend today, is that I think people are feeling in some senses like kind of a lack of ownership. It's like they kind of are feeling like they're bouncing from thing to thing. And I think part of it is trying to help people start to see like, how do you figure out a way to kind of own your own story, your own destiny, your trajectory? And it's hard to do, but I think it's kind of what we all crave, is a little bit more of that agency and autonomy today.
I think actually diving back into history really helped me to get to that level
hmm
because you look at all the different characters throughout history in a different context when times were a lot simpler and they could be more present, more mindful. But they had these like crazy goals and ideas of where was going to take them
Yep.
if they just followed the trail. And you can look back now and you can see the mistakes that they made,
Hmm.
and you
Hmm.
can learn from them within the context of today's world, which to me is a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think, and this is something, and we'll talk a bit more about so the work that I did around mentorship today. But I think part of what has happened a lot too is I think that with a lot of the nostalgia for the ways things were, is that I think, we think that it would be easier if it were that. Well, it's not ever going to be that way again. But part of it is understanding that you sort of can learn from the past, but apply it to today. And I think that's something, you talked about these journeys we're on. I spent a lot of time really trying to understand the idea of this kind of hero's journey that has pervaded all of our lives. Like, Joseph Campbell talks about it, and we see it in the ways that we imagine life. And I even saw it when I started looking at, my students, ambitious people, and they really, they see this hero's journey. They know they're on this journey, and they're all looking for this like magical mentor. They're Yoda, they're Dumbledore, they're Glinda the Good Witch. And I think what's interesting about it is that I don't know if that was ever true, but the reality of it is that I just don't think it's what we need. Like we today don't, there's not one person who's going to unlock our success and one person is going to take us under our wings and make us who we are. We're going to have a set of people that come into our lives that play mentoring and other kind of relationships with us. But I think it is good to learn from the past, but also not to idealize it so much so that we realize that like, hey, it's different, but that doesn't all bad. It's just, it's different. And I think part of it is taking advantage of the good from today and learning what we can from the past.
There's a lot in there that I think is kind of painful and troublesome for a lot of people.
Hmm.
And it mostly spins around the idea of the victim story, as
Yep.
well as the people that flow in and out of your life, the grief
Yes.
that comes from attachment.
Yep. Yep. I think I think a lot of it comes, and it's an interesting piece there because I think a lot of it comes down to a sense of loneliness. I think the more we're more connected than we've ever been in human history, right? You can connect with people all over the world in an instant, and everyone is connected, and yet more people are lonely than ever, right? There's a loneliness epidemic into it, and I think that was one of the big insights that I really had is looking at people that, and I think part of it comes down from these stories that we tell ourselves, right? If you think about this hero's journey, people feel, so I study mentorship a lot to understand what it's like. And kind of a crazy thing, almost 80% of people will tell you that having a mentor is critical for your life and career success, right? Like 80% of us will tell you that one. And that's a big number. And yet, less than or nearly a third, only a third of people have a mentor today that they would describe as a mentor. So that gap right there is really what I would call the loneliness epidemic, right? This idea that like I know I need other people to help me succeed, and yet I don't have this person that society has told me I need to have, that movies and film and television have reinforced. So that big gap is, I think, what's really contributing to it. And I think that's really where I started to get fascinated by this idea of, what does it actually mean today to have, people in our lives? How do you build relationships that matter? How do you think more thoughtfully about building real relationships as opposed to these idealized ones into it? And I think that's what I started to see a lot in my students is when they stopped looking for their Dumbledore door or their Glinda the Good Witch, and they started realizing like maybe there's a lot of people in my lives that play these roles. It's not just one person, but there's a bunch of people. I can start to cultivate those relationships and find ways to collaborate. And I think that's really where the future is going, is it's really, collaboration based relationship building around things that matter, that we care about. And I think that's kind of why the work you do is so interesting about helping people have these shared experiences. Because I think shared collaboration experiences about things that matter, those are the people who are thriving, and those are the people who aren't sort of suffering through some of those challenges of feeling alone and feeling, as you rightly said, kind of like a victim in their own skin.
It's that loneliness factor that I think is the most important part of that, because that's something I've been dealing with a lot in the people that I work with, but also in my journey of growth. I remember I isolated extremely,
Mm. Hmm.
and at times I'd have moments where I'd want to reach out and start trying to form relationships. And most of the people that I would encounter were also, on their own and trying to do the same thing. But I think where the rails never connected was
Mm.
through the view,
Hmm.
the lenses that you look at the word loneliness. A
Hmm.
lot of people look at that as very uncomfortable, very scary and
Hmm.
empty. And therefore they want to plug and play whatever comes along the corner, regardless of who or what it is. But then, the lens that I seen it through was a lens of growth, of
Hmm.
opportunity. It became a space for me to truly befriend myself,
Hmm.
be able to question everything that I was encountering. And
Hmm.
in studying Crazy Horse, there's a lot of passages and moments and stories of him doing the exact same thing in
Hmm.
the course of all the conflict that he was involved with throughout his life.
Yeah, 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 and again, I think it's that self-reflection, right, is the thing that I think not enough of us do, and really to understand, what those elements and those pieces are.
And that brings us to an interesting kind of crossroads there, because a lot of people that I've experienced turn to mentors for improvement on leadership
Hmm.
and, growth in like a business or professional arena. But they really stop short at the fact that this is a tool that can be applied to your personal life and your personal growth as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what I found a lot. So I think, taking kind of a step back a little bit just to sort of share like how I kind of came to this realization was I'd had a really interesting set of, experiences. I started companies and I was kind of in this gap period in my own life. And I was talking to a buddy of mine. He's like, "What are you up to?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to spend the next couple months doing some mentoring." And, because I thought that sounded, what do you do, right? You mentor people. And he turned to me and kind of asked a question very much like offhanded to him, but to me it hit me. And he said, "Are you any good at mentoring?" And I thought to myself, well, of course, like I have to be good. Like all these people are coming to me, right? Definitely, I have to be good, right? And but I really didn't know the answer. Like I was like, how am I any good? Like, am I actually good at it? And it was a question that really like gnawed at me. So I decided to sort of see. So I wanted to design an experiment to see. So I took about 4 months. And over those 4 months, I said I would meet with anyone who wanted my help, my mentorship, and that support. And so this was anyone from, hey, I'm starting a company. I want to pick your brain. I'm going to raise funds. I'm a college student looking for a job, whatever it was. But I took any meeting who would come and I basically really thought about it very thoughtfully. I was going to be thoughtful about this mentorship experience. So over those 4 months, I had 81 sort of initial meetings with people at what I would describe as kind of in a mentorship role or relationship. And I really was thoughtful. I wanted to figure out who they were, what they were doing. I did research in advance. And then I sat down with them and then really just talked and see what I could do behind it. And I offered them some guidance, some insights, really some advice that I thought could help them based on what they came to me about. And I said, "Hey, here's something I would go do if I were you. Why don't you go try it and then come back and tell me how it went and we can have a future meeting." And so my theory was I'm going to give great advice and see how many of them come back telling me about how the advice worked. And so I looked out then at the, results of this about 6 months later. Any guesses of what happened to those 81 people? How many of them came back and shared with me how they applied the advice, those kind of things?
I'm kind of thinking somewhere around maybe less than half.
Zero. Zero came back. And so I realized in that moment, I may be the worst mentor in human history, right? Like I gave them this advice, I gave them these things to do, and none of them came back. One of them did come back a year later. But I realized in that part of it is that the truth of the matter is, as I talk to these people later on, that humans don't need more advice. Most of us aren't looking for more advice. We're not looking for someone to tell us what to do. Really, what they wanted was more opportunities. And I started to realize is that they didn't come to me saying, "Tell me what to do." They actually came saying, "Help me do what I already know I want to do." And that was the big aha for me. And so I sort of stepped back and said, all right, this is interesting. What we've got here is a mismatch. People come asking for opportunities and they leave with advice, and nobody wants advice, right? Like, I don't need to be told more to do. I probably already know it. I'm looking for other things. And that was the big aha that really helped me understand my own life. When I looked back, I don't really have a single person that I would sort of say we ever like said, "You're my mentor and I'm your mentee," right? We never had that relationship. But I have a set of people in my life who unlocked tremendous opportunities, whether they were my boss, Dan, whether a guy, Nick, I worked with, this partner of mine who in a project, Steve Blank. I had these really interesting people. But what I realized is that what was unique about those mentoring relationships is they didn't give me advice. They collaborated with me on something. That collaboration was the key. And so I actually started to realize that you don't need mentors, you need super mentors. And super mentors are the people that build a relationship, a rapport with you through collaboration. And so a lot of what I started to learn as I studied hundreds and hundreds of successful people and realizes that people go out seeking a mentor because they want someone to help them. Start with the project. Pick a project and then attract people to that project to build relationships. You don't need one person to help you. And the going back to the movie reference, I don't think that people are out there thinking they need to find Dumbledore or Yoda or whoever it is. The reality is those are the wrong movies. The better movie to think about is Ocean's 11. All of us are Danny Ocean, and we're planning a big old heist. Whatever your version is, you know what you want to do. You don't want one person to help you. You need a team of people, 10 others, the 11. And so today's successful people really aren't going out there saying, gosh, I hope I can find one person to help me succeed. Instead, it's build your crew, get people into it. But the important thing to know is it's not just saying, hey, can you give me advice? It's saying, hey, let's work on something together. And that's what builds these relationships that help unlock opportunities. Now, if, you and I have had a relationship where we've, been on the podcast together, now we have a rapport and relationship so we can unlock opportunities. And I can introduce you to more people and vice versa. We have this rapport to open doors together. So it really is the future about creating these collaborative relationships that unlock opportunities. And that was a big aha. We're focused on the wrong stories. The hero's journey, that's the old way. It's really more about the heist journey. How do you build a group of people together with a shared, aligned, project-based thing, and then let that create opportunities? And the reason it's so powerful for people is it increases your opportunity surface area. I'm not dependent on one person to unlock my success. Instead, I've got 10 or more who each person now has a reason to recommend me, give me opportunity capital, help me in those ways. So now it's not just one person I'm dependent on, it's 10 who I've built real authentic relationships and created opportunities through.
I think when you shift the perspective from the common way of thinking to a more colorful palette, such as what we're talking about here, you take away a lot of the stigma. You take away a lot of the shame.
Yep.
Like, hey, I feel like I'm failing, or if I'm on a mental health journey and I'm 10 miles down in a hole, those are things that we really get stuck on. But when you
Mm-hmm.
make it sound like it's more of, I'm just looking for a conversation, or I'm just looking for, somebody to kind of blow off a little bit of steam, it
Yep.
takes away that stigma that we all put on the idea of looking for help.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's funny too, and I think what I've started to learn about this is the real secret. Like I said, if you're finding yourself stuck, whether it's that loneliness, the mental health challenges, those sort of things, if it's career wise, if it's business wise, the real secret is sitting down and saying, how can I design an experience that creates and forces collaboration, right? And when I started to study successful people today, and I did some really interesting research to study the Forbes 30 under 30. So the Forbes 30 under 30 is a group. At the time when I studied it, there's about 6,000 people who'd been named to the Forbes 30 under 30 list. These are all people under the age of 30, so they're in their 20s, and they were people who'd been recognized for being exceptional. And so, I wanted to figure out like what was unique about those people. And it wasn't what school they went to. They didn't go to the best schools. I mean, some of them certainly did, but there were 500 different schools that they'd all attended to. So it wasn't just the smartest kids who went to the best schools. It wasn't people who went to the best graduate schools, right? It wasn't like, I went to this graduate school. In fact, more people on the list didn't go to college or dropped out than went to graduate school. And it wasn't people who had been starting companies when they were, 13, 14, 15 years old. They did start companies, but usually later. But what was common in all of those people? 84% of them had some kind of a demonstrable, meaningful project that they shared, that they listed. They were people who were hosting an event that brought people together, an event series or a conference. They might be, the host of a podcast. They might have written a book. They might have, there's these projects that people did. And what was so cool about it is they all required them to, share this project. They required them to collaborate through this project. And it was something that was not, outside of their normal work confines into it. So that really interesting way to, again, reconnect with people, but do it in the context of something that's meaningful, that's purposeful, that's aligned to where you're going. That's the secret today of modern mentorship. All those people that, are part of this podcast now, they're all part of your mentor crew, right? They're all part of that group into it. And that's really what it is you want to have an excuse to collaborate on something that you care about.
I think it gets back to building that tribe, you know,
Exactly.
and in order to get there, you really got to do that inner work. You got to kind of look at your morals, at your values, places you want to go. Find those things that really speak to yourself. Because I know for myself, I'm very much an introvert, and doing this is obviously on the other end of the spectrum. However, however, the motivation to do it was to actually work on myself, to work on my social anxiety and things like that.
Yeah.
And from there, it's brought a rallying point. It's brought conversation and people into the mix that just helps to grow not only the project, but more importantly, the people that I work with, the
Yeah.
people that I interact with. It gives them all these new tools to discover their ability to rewrite their own journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I think it is. And I think and that's why I love your message here about rewrite your journey, because I think a lot of us are on the traditional hero's journey. We think that that's the journey that we're on, and we become disillusioned and disheartened because a lot of that means we need that mentor to guide us through the tough times. And so that's really what a lot of people have. Again, if you just look at that gap, 80+% of us think that a mentor is critical for success, and yet a third of us have it. This gap is huge. It's massive. And all these people feel like it's something wrong with me. Well, everyone tells me I need a mentor, or I need this guide, or whatever it is, this Sherpa, and I don't have it. So something must be wrong with me. When the reality is, you just need to rewrite your journey. And that is to say, hey, you don't need one person. Just build a crew of a bunch of people who have casual relationships with you. You don't need someone to check in with you every week. You don't need someone, build a nonprofit that you're going to work on together and invite people to be part of it, or put on an event, or go on a kind of an endeavor together, write a book together, do a podcast. There's all these opportunities behind it. But I think when you start to look at it as not one person, but as a project that builds people together, the whole thing unlocks. And I think that's what's happening, is that the mentorship journey needs to be rewritten for the modern world, which is to say it's not about one person, this mentor figure, this guide. Instead, it's about a collaboration of people who increase your opportunity surface area.
So, basically, I think the target that you're trying to hit on is that redefining the vocabulary, and
Yes.
that's been a huge part of my mental health journey and my professional journey and everything else, is rewriting and blazing this trail to discover this positive way
Yeah.
of looking at the obstacles that you're up against.
Yeah. Yeah, it entirely, that's true. And I think it's language matters, right? Like the way we talk about and understand things. And I think it's, the reason, and as you know, I love books. Books are my thing now. And I've helped all the people behind there, 2,500 published authors now. And a lot of the reason I love books is because books offer that really different way to rewrite the process of writing a book in our own story. So most people for the longest time have imagined that successful authors go off into a cabin and they type away for, 2 years, and they come out with this brilliant thing and magic happens. And what we've really tried to help people is to remember that, like, most successful authors, they don't write alone. They have support, networks, communities, friends, all that kind of stuff behind it. And that's where I think it is you want to rewrite the story, give language behind it. But I think it's destigmatizing the fact that, like, hey, having help, having a community, having supporters, having collaborators, it's not because you're weak. It's because you are thoughtful. It's because you recognize that, like, it's better with more people. They have bigger outcomes into it. And so I think that's why I love these experiences in particular. 81% of people have write a book on their bucket list. And yet at the same time, it is the most failed activity that people do. Like 98% of people that start a book will never finish it. So all these people want to do it, and all these people fail at it. Why? Well, it's because they write alone. And so once you start to realize that a book isn't a solitary endeavor, it's a project to build community, to build relationships and grow, the thing changes, right? Like now your hero's journey isn't you hoping for magic. It's a new journey where you bring people together, you're on the journey together. And the best part about a hero's journey where it's not just you, but it's a crew, you can celebrate at the end with a big old party, right? You celebrate the launch of your book, you celebrate the launch of your podcast, you have the drinks after the party that you put on for your conference. Like that's what's neat about these things is it gives us more shared celebration opportunities. And that's the biggest anecdote to the loneliness crisis is to say now we can wind up have collaborative experiences that allow us to do something with a couple hours a week with people we care about. It's amazing. Personal development happens alongside this sort of professional and other things development when you pick a project like that.
Yeah, it's basically the idea of utilizing everything within the environment around you.
Yep. Yep.
You know, it's stepping outside of survival mode
Yeah.
because in a sense you built a camp, so you've built a shelter, you've got your fire, you're able to take care of getting drinking water, you got food. Now we're going out and we're starting to build chairs and we're building all these other things to make life that much more comfortable. And it all comes from the environment that you put yourself in.
Yep. Yep. It's the transition from survival mode to thrival mode, right? Thrival mode is where now you've got that, we're surviving. How do we thrive? And I do think it's one of those things that, it's sort of typically it's hard to survive just by yourself in a place. And so if you're doing it, that's difficult. You very rarely will make the leap into thrival mode because you're just, you're doing it all. But when you move into that space where, hey, let's build a shared camp, let's all try to get this stuff, let's all survive. Well, now you can start to do thrival things. And again, I think it's part of the idea of, it takes a little bit of vulnerability too, right? I think part of what happens in society today is we sort of feel like asking for help means that we're a burden. It means that we're incomplete. There's things wrong behind us. And the reality of it is that's sort of what makes life worth living, right? And I oftentimes joke, I put out 2 books last year, Super Mentors and Pennymore's, a novel project with my kids. And I have this author community that I lead and I teach and I share. And yet I struggled alone with those books because I sort of felt like, well, shouldn't I know what I'm doing? And as soon as I started participating with others, I kind of, was vulnerable, was humble. The whole thing changed. And so it is a really funny thing that I think today a lot of this comes down to being vulnerable, being honest, and quite frankly, building that tribe, as you rightly said, of other people who are wrestling together. Just because it's hard doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Sometimes it's just hard, right? Which is the important point.
Well, the hard part though is the important part because
Well said.
the good things don't come without the work, the challenge, and the adversity. So once you start to lean on other people, you get a little bit more confident.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that confidence turns into perseverance. And ultimately, just like the spider and the way that he spins his web from one end to the other, millions of times over, one thread at a time, in order to achieve a goal of living and thriving. I
Yep.
feel like spider medicine is actually something that's clotted around this conversation. So I want you to talk a little bit as we come to the end of this conversation about the value of connection
Yeah.
and
Well,
how to build it.
yeah, and I think it's it's sort of it's kind of been the core of my work and research and focus for the last 8 or 9 years has really been about that idea. And I think the important thing to know, and I think it really is taking and moving from almost this idea of being connected to collaboration. And I think that's kind of the shift that I think people want to find. I think the challenge today is that we are more connected than ever, right? We're connected to our phones. We're connected to all these people loosely on social platforms. We're connected in all these ways, but they're really loose connections. We have these very, very sort of like extended networks, but very small number of deep connections behind it. And so I think what's important to sort of take stock in as we think about where we're heading, whether it's, to find a different career path, to accelerate, to sort of take care of ourselves and be happier, build relationships, is an understanding that in general, connection is not necessarily mean deep connection. And so just because we're connected on social media doesn't mean that we actually are truly like deeply connected into it. So take stock in kind of what you have in front of you. Then I think the real thing to understand is that really to build community and to build collaboration, you will have to likely take charge of that. You have to take agency autonomy. In general, it's going to need to be something that you identify a project you care about. You care about this idea behind it. And the neat part that I discovered in Super Mentors is there's really these 8 types of projects I saw from all the people who talked about having these powerful relationships. These 8 projects were ones that, they didn't, really like require more than about a year. Most of the projects were 6 to 12 months that the person would take. Number 2, they all required collaboration. They needed people to be a part of it. And number 3, they were things that the person really cared about. So that's what's neat about it, whether it's, writing your first book, whether it's putting on a podcast, whether it's doing a video show, whether it's building a course, putting on an event series, there's a bunch of projects out there. But I think once you sort of say is like, hey, I'm feeling a little bit disconnected or I'm feeling like I'm not achieving my potential, step 1 is to say, all right, what's something that I want to spend time on every week? I want to spend 2 to 6 hours a week working on this project, this thing. So step 1 is recognize what you got. Step 2 is identify what that project is that you're excited about. And many of us will know these things, like you'll figure it out very quickly, but figure out what that thing is. Then step 3 is to not try and do it alone. It's to remember that how do I build collaboration into that one? For the most part, a lot of this collaboration will be activating this network that's loosely connected. It's reaching out to a friend of yours from high school saying, hey, remember how we did that like screenplay back when we were sophomores? Like, have you ever thought about like maybe actually seeing if we could do this thing and building a project that way? Or, taking people that you work with and say, hey, we should do kind of a monthly meetup about people who are fans of anime here. Whatever that is turning that into a more specific and collaborative project. And then number 3 is just continuing to invite people onto the journey of that one. That's the real secret of it. But I think connection is important. We are connected, but we are not tightly connected with people. The antidote to that is collaboration on something. So the gap from sort of connection into collaboration is find a project you care about and then invite people into it and have a shared outcome together. That's the secret for people, whatever your project may be, it sort of doesn't matter, but it matters that you care about the project, you make it collaborative, and then you're Danny Ocean, right? You're the one who's designing the heist, whether your heist is to publish a book, whether your heist is to put out a podcast, whether your heist is to, do an event series. But when you think about it as you are sort of the hero in this heist story and you're bringing people a part of it, it's a good heist, mind you. It's a good heist. When you think about it that way, you move from that idea of loose connection into deep and aligned connection. That's where the magic happens.
I think that's very well said. So as we come to the end, though, let people know how to work with you, what you got coming up, all that good stuff.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that one, and yeah, I mean, thank you for spending time here, and I think it's awesome to talk about helping people rewrite their journey and to use your wise words. But yeah, I love what I get to do. I am a professor here at Georgetown. I teach classes throughout the year, so certainly that's fun. So I work with MBA students, undergrads, and that's a big part of it. A lot of where I'm really spending my time these days is building an author community, and so that was actually how you and I connected here. Every year we help about 300 to 400 first-time authors really have that communal experience of writing and publishing a book. So 2,500 published authors now, almost 400 National Book Award winners and finalists, which is insane. But our whole philosophy is that you never write alone. And so I'm always happy to chat with people. The author community is called Manuscripts. We are a B Corporation. We're a social venture. And our mission is to really empower more underheard voices in books and publishing. So that's a big part of it. And that's really how I've learned to best apply my knowledge about super mentorship into this one. I feel like in some ways, my by helping people write a book, I'm kind of a super mentor to some of these people who need that kind of support and guidance along the way. So that's really fun. And yeah, if anyone ever has questions or wants to talk about, modern mentorship, I come and talk at universities and schools about really ways, as well as companies, to talk about today how to think differently about modern mentorship, not as the hero's journey, but as this, Danny Ocean heist story, how you can increase your opportunity surface area. So feel free to connect with me. Like I said, I'm always happy to chat. And, if you want to grab 15 minutes just to talk about your own heist story and whether or not I can help you in it, I'm always happy to chat.
Awesome. Eric, it's always a pleasure when we get together. So thank you very much.
Bet. Thank you, sir.
I don't believe in goodbyes. So until we meet again, whether it's this life or the next, have a safe and prosperous journey.